Now I want to talk to you about boundaries. Really what I'm talking to you is mostly about lessons that I learned along the way. I would tell you a brief story is that Earl, I had asked him to get a counselor, and he finally found a fellow who had talked about lying by omission. And Earl said, I think I'd like to go up and meet with him and see. And he did. And Dan turned out to be fantastic. He was exactly what Earl needed. And he was able to call Earl on things. And so I tried some counselors in the Portland area, and a lot of them didn't want to see me because Earl had been their professor. And they said, if it's about you and Earl, we're not willing to see you. And I checked out a couple, and they just weren't able to help me to the level I needed. So finally I said to Earl, I said, I'm gonna go up with you and meet with Dan. And so we had gone several times, and he began to help us kind of think through some issues. Now I knew he was Earl's counselor, and so I understood that, he could help me, but he would always need to be very protective of Earl in a healthy sense, not in a bad way. So we went up one day, and we'd been up several times before, and when we got there, he said to Earl, how was the trip up? And Earl said, oh, it was a really good trip up. And I was seething angry. And he turned to me, and I was glad he asked, because he said, Sandy, how was the trip up for you? And I said, I am so angry I can hardly stand it. And Earl looked really shocked, like, what? And I said, I asked him to slow down because he was driving faster than I was comfortable. And he'd do it, and then within a minute or two, he was back up to a very fast speed again. And I said, I am just so angry about that, I can hardly stand it. And Dan kind of let us talk more about it, and finally he turned to me. Now see, but this is what I really wanted. I wanted him to turn to Earl and say, Earl, shame on you. Now you drive the right speed, and Earl would thereafter do it. Did that seem simple? Well, we want real simple answers to life, but instead what Dan did was he turned to me and he said, Sandy, he said, why don't you draw a boundary? And I said, okay. What would that look like? And I said, I don't have a clue what you're talking about. And he said, well, you could say, he says, you can't control Earl's driving. And I said, yes, I know that. He said, but you could say, Earl, I would like you to drive this speed, and if you want to go faster than that, please just let me out in the next town, and I'll take a taxi or an airplane or a bus to get wherever I'm going. And so I thought, okay, I guess I could do that. Then he asked a very interesting question. He said, Sandy, why do you ride with Earl when he drives so fast? And I said, and this embarrasses me to tell you, I said, he's my husband. And I was embarrassed after I left. I thought, okay, so he's my husband, so he can mistreat me any way he wants? But I think we get stuck in some of that. I was actually glad later I'd been that honest with him, because it really helped me to get a hold of this, that I needed to take charge of some things. It was helpful for him to at least give me a kind of an idea of a boundary, and it needed to be drawn. And so I finally said to Earl that if he wanted to drive faster than the speed I'd asked, then he would need to let me out in the next town. Well, Earl chose to not drive faster than that when I was along. But I still felt a lot of confusion around boundaries. I didn't quite understand it. And then one day I came across a chart when I was looking for something, and I want to introduce you to the chart because it began to help me understand the need for boundaries and why it was I hadn't had it clear in my own mind before that. It starts with the fact that I need to act on what I can control. I can control my own thoughts, my own behaviors, and my own feelings. And I know that seems big and overwhelming right now, but I think just kind of beginning to know that our feelings come from our thoughts. And so sometimes if we begin to get more and more control on our thoughts, we're going to have better control on our feelings. But that's what I need to be doing. Well, what happens is I move over to try to control what I can't control. And I start acting on what I can't control. So when Earl and I used to ride in the car, I would try to control his behavior. And first I'd ask him to slow down. There's nothing wrong with that. And drive X speed. Then he wouldn't, he'd go there and then he'd go right back up to the speed he'd been driving. And I get so angry, and then I'd think, okay, I'll mention that he's going to kill me. And so I would say, if you keep at this speed, you're going to kill me. And he'd keep at the speed, and I'd get angrier. And then I tried, and I call this manipulation. Then I would say, you're going to kill the kids. And I didn't understand that I could have a boundary. And so I just kept upping the ante, trying to get him to do what I wanted him to do. And so as Dan had brought up this idea of boundaries, and the very fact that I can't control Earl's behavior, but I can take care of myself. And so I need to put in place a boundary that does that very thing, where I'm taking care of myself and my children also, in a sense, but I need to be able to say, here's where it is, and if you want to go faster than that, I can't control that. And I need to just let him go faster, but I did think if I got out and I took a taxi, I was going to give him the bill, though I wasn't going to pay that myself. So that was one thing. So this chart was really helpful because what it tells me is I can't control his thinking, I can't control his feelings, and I can't control his behaviors. And when I try to do that, it's ceaselessly striving. And I don't know about you, but if you've ever tried to do that, you get more and more upset as you do. Finally, you feel hopeless and helpless and angry. You feel out of control. You feel crazy. And so we're trying to do what we actually can't do. Well, then some of us move down into another box, and it's what we don't act when we can control it. In other words, if I don't take care of myself, I end up feeling put upon. I end up becoming passive. I become, sometimes we call it the victim, and feel sorry for myself, and exactly that was how I felt when we got up there that day. I was feeling really sorry for myself that Earl hadn't listened to me. But I didn't know what to do, anything different. I didn't know I had choices, I guess would be one of the words I would say. And that box ends up, you feel, it's what we refer to as a learned helplessness. I just become more and more helpless. So what I want to do is move back up there in that box where I'm in charge of my thoughts, my behaviors, and my feelings. And in a sense, then I need to put Earl down in what I refer to as God's box. Leave it up to God. I need to say, God, here it is. Deal with it as you can with Earl. And if Earl never drives a sane speed, well, maybe I got to drive my own car. There are other ways to deal with a lot of these problems. See, that doesn't mean that Earl can't drive fast if he chooses to do that. But he can't drive fast with me in the car because I have drawn that boundary. I would rather get out and ride on a bus or a taxi or whatever, or drive my own car. And I think one thing you need to know, the boundary truly is for you. It's not to control the other person's behavior. And we get that mixed up. We sometimes think, well, if I draw this boundary, then he'll do X or Y or Z. Nope, the boundary's for you. Well, now that all sounds wonderful. You go, oh, good deal. Now I got it, Sandy. I can go and have boundaries. Well, I thought the same thing. So we headed back to Portland, and I had thought through the thing with the car, and that worked pretty good. But one day I realized I'd been at work, and I decided I wanted to hot fudge sundae. And I tell you this story because it's really embarrassing to me, but it'll help you to go, okay, boundaries aren't easy. Anyway, I wanted a hot fudge sundae, and I pulled into the Dairy Queen, and I pulled up to their window, and I ordered my hot fudge sundae, and I said, please don't make it until I get up to after I've paid. And so they said, okay. And anyway, I pulled down in. You have to kind of turn a corner to get down to where the window is to pick it up. And I turned the corner, and I could see in the window where he was collecting money from all the cars in front of me. And all of a sudden, I saw a sundae appear in the window. But now, I believe I've asked for what I wanted. I don't even think about the fact that that's my sundae. I think it's going to be for somebody else. I get up to the window because, you see, I've told them I want mine hot. I get up to the window, I pay them, And he reaches over and he hands me the one that's been sitting in the window all that time. Now this is embarrassing, ladies. I take it and I thank him and I drive away. And I get back on the road, and all of a sudden now I've started to let myself feel feelings more, and I recognize I'm angry because I'd asked for what I wanted and he gave me what he wanted to. And so I turned the car around, and this is, as I mentioned, this is the embarrassing part. I walked into the Dairy Queen. I didn't ask him to make me a new one, which you're all thinking I did. But I didn't. I slammed it down on the counter and I screamed, "No one ever listens to me!" And then I turned around and marched out. Okay, so I didn't know how to carry through on all this, which would have been a lot more sane to have asked for one, but it was huge because I recognized for the first time in my life I stood up for myself. I just stood up for myself. Maybe not pretty, but I stood up for myself. And that's how probably most of you are going to learn to do boundaries. We aren't very good at it at first, but we got to start somewhere. And then we add to it and we begin to get better at it. Now, we don't need a boundary on everything. For one thing, that'd drive you crazy if you had a boundary on all these things. But when we ask for things and we don't get it, sometimes we need to sit down and think, what's gone on here? Do I need to have a boundary or do I need to figure out other choices? So I think in learning to heal from something like this, boundaries are huge. If you're going to stay with your husband, one of the things you got to know is that you need to make a decision what you're going to live with the rest of your life. You see, am I going to live with his continuing to act out behavior? Somewhere you got to decide how much you're going to live with. And you can decide it. I have women decide all the way along the whole thing. Some of them say, well, if he wants to look at porn, that's fine. I said to Earl, no more anything. If you continue to act out, you go ahead and go do that somewhere else, but you don't get to do it with me. And see, ladies, somewhere you've got to draw your line. And no one else can do it for you. We often want somebody else to tell us, well, where should that line be? See, because of wherever you draw your line, you have to live with the consequences of that behavior. One of the things that I mentioned in this, that Earl and I would go up and see Dan every now and then. Well, one day we were Earl had gotten his stuff pretty, he was doing pretty good in thinking through and changing a lot of his behaviors. But one of the things that kept coming up for me was that I thought, if we're going to reestablish this marriage relationship, then I need to know that Earl thinks about me every day. It was just something I really needed just for me. And so I decided to make this request while we were with Dan, and I did. And I said, Earl, I'm very visual, so if you just take a yellow tablet and on it you would write, I thought of you today. I said, that's really all I'm asking for. I said, I guess you can even say the same sentence every day. I don't really care. I just need to know that you made the effort to write it on that piece of paper so I could see it. So we went home and we'd go back to see Dan every couple of weeks. And so when we went back the next time, we walk in, we sat down, and Dan said to Earl, how'd you do? And Earl said, well, I did really good. He said, I did 5 out of 7 days. And you see, when you haven't been doing it at all, that was huge improvement for Earl. But then Dan turned to me and he said, Sandy, how are you doing with that? And I said, he's just told me I'm not worth the effort for 7 days. I said, it hurt a lot that he only did 5 days. I said, I'm in a lot of pain over it. And Earl went, oh. You see, he thought he had done such a good job, but he had really communicated tons to me. And that communication was that, you're just not worth extra effort. And so when we left that day, we sort of left it hanging there. I didn't know what was going to happen. And for every day for the next 2 years, Earl wrote me a note. I don't believe he missed a day. And then after that, one day I said to him, okay, Earl, I was beginning to have yellow pieces of paper all over the house. Sometimes he'd buy me a card. He did different things. Sometimes he'd bring home flowers. he just did a huge variety of things for that 2 years. And I said, okay, Earl, I don't need you to do it every day, but when you're going to go out of town, it would be really important to me that you do it. And so he said, okay, you know, and he did a lot better verbally, telling me at that time what he was feeling and thinking about me and that type of thing. So I was very comfortable with it. Well, he did the first, I don't know how many trips, but I'll say 5 or 6 trips. He would always leave me a note for every day. It was a, you know, it was a really kind of a fun experience for me. And it helped me a lot to know that he made that effort before he'd leave on a trip. Well, one time he was gone for a trip and he didn't leave a thing. And he was gone quite a while, as I remember, and I was devastated. I just thought, oh no, here we go again. You know, I do it just long enough to make you feel different and then drop the ball. And so I sat there and I said to the Lord, okay, Lord, I need to communicate clearly with Earl that this has really hurt. And I said, but I don't know what to do. And I kept thinking about it, and finally it was kind of like the Lord said, okay, Sandy, what communicates love to you? And I said, well, one of the things it does is red roses. And I got this idea with God's help, and I called the florist, and I ordered a dozen red roses in a vase. I said, I want them to be very attractive. And she said, well, that's going to be a pretty good chunk of money. And I said, that's all right. And so she said, now, who do you want me to put on it? And I said, well, write on it, I love you, and then sign it. And it should be from Earl. And she said, okay. So she said, I'll write, I love you, and sign it Earl's name. She said, now, who's it for? And I said, it's for Sandy. And she said, all right. And she said, and who are you? And I said, well, I'm Sandy. She was a little quiet for a few moments, and then she said, and how would you like to bill this? And I said, on Earl's credit card. And I'm going to tell you, it was an interesting experience, because when Earl came home that night from his trip, he walked in the door, and here's this gorgeous, beautiful bouquet of roses. And he said, oh, because he knew immediately that he had dropped the ball. And he's kind of cheap. So again, he didn't make that mistake again. From then on, he always left me notes when he'd go out of town. But I guess sometimes when we're rebuilding a relationship like this, you've got to do some kind of drastic things to get their attention. Now, every one of your husbands is going to be different. And you're different. You might say, Sandy, what would you want to have those yellow pieces of paper around for? But that's what you've got to get to where you know yourself. One day it dawned on me that God probably has the greatest example of a boundary that I know of. I'll quote you John 3:16. I said it's just the simplest verse in some ways, but it's the most powerful verse I know of. It says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. And what it's really saying in there is that we have God, and then he has us, and because we've sinned, we can't go to heaven. And he made a provision for us of his Son. And if we accept what his Son came and died for us and rose, if we accept that, then we can go to heaven. He says, I love you, children, very much. I want you to come and be with me. But you have to accept the gift that I gave you to do that. So he gives us choice. And yet he has a very firm boundary. And we can say, well, I don't like your boundary. I want to work my way to heaven. And he says, it doesn't work that way. But he still loves us. It isn't that a boundary is put in place to be mean to us. It's because that's what their boundary is. That's where they've set their line. And God has said, I need you to accept the gift that I'm giving.